As always, everything's bigger in Texas, and there's a ton to talk about. This is now the most expensive Senate primary anywhere.
Runoffs in Texas do tend to favor the more, conservative, grassrootsy candidate because turnout is lower.
Is it possible, though, that the National Republican Senatorial Committee is going to find itself having to defend Paxton as the Republican nominee?
And I think it's interesting, so far through early voting, we've seen Democrats outvoting Republicans. The Republican electorate that's been turning out has been old. That's been definitely the biggest feature. I have a feeling this one is going to be close.
Welcome to the Decision Desk HQ Podcast. I'm Geoffrey Skelley, your host, the Chief Elections Analyst here at DDHQ. Hey, it's almost primary time. This coming Tuesday, March 3rd, 3 states, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Texas, will hold their regular primaries to nominate candidates for various federal and state offices. This will begin a 6-month run of primaries across 50 states and the District of Columbia, with the final races occurring all the way in mid-September. But on March 3rd, Texas will be hosting the biggest contests in the state's U.S. Senate race. Republican Senator John Cornyn is caught in a three-way primary clash with State Attorney General Ken Paxton and Representative Wesley Hunt, with a potential runoff on May 26th looming because no candidate looks likely to win a majority. And Texas is one of a few southern states that requires a majority to win a nomination. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, you have two sort of fast-rising Democratic candidates, up-and-comers in Representative Jasmine Crockett and State Representative James Talarico, who are both hoping to put the state in play in November. Down the ballot, some U.S. House primaries have grabbed their own share of headlines. Most notably, Representative Tony Gonzalez faces a tough primary challenge under a cloud of scandal regarding an alleged affair with a staffer. The staffer committed suicide last September, and earlier this week, texts that showed Gonzalez had sent explicit messages to the staffer came out, which has led even some Republicans in Congress to call for his resignation. Beyond that race, Texas's redistricted map has precipitated a number of heated primary contests for both parties. And so, as always, everything's bigger in Texas, and there's a ton to talk about. And to get into what's happening in the Lone Star State, I am very thrilled to welcome Gabby Birenbaum, the Washington Correspondent for the Texas Tribune. Gabby joined us back in December to talk about Texas at the filing deadline, and now she's back to help us get a handle on everything that's happening on Tuesday. So, Gabby, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Crazy how quickly this primary season is gone. Feels like it was just filing deadline day.
Yeah, well, Texas is one of the first states to vote, and they just, though the fact that there's the possibility of some primary runoffs stretching this thing out for another 2.5 months or so, nearly 3 months, may make this a little longer for some of the races.
For sure.
And I guess actually, maybe that's the natural place to start, which is with the U.S. Senate race and the Republican primary. Where Republican Senator John Cornyn looks to be in some trouble. And so I was kind of curious if there's been some talk, I think, in the last few days here at the end about some attack ads being run against Wesley Hunt, who's sort of the third candidate in this race with John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. And I was sort of curious. Hunt has made this out to be like evidence that he's rising and, maybe catching up here at the end. And there was a poll that just came out that found Hunt only a little bit back in third place. And so I was just kind of curious what your take is at this point on sort of the competitiveness of this three-way contest.
Yeah, I think you can sort of take it two ways. I think the Hunt camp would certainly argue they don't want to face us, in a runoff because he could win. And I think that might be true. Hunt has something up on both Paxton and Cornyn. On Paxton, he's, long made the case he can both excite the MAGA base the way Paxton does. Without turning people off because of the ethical baggage that Paxton carries between, various investigations and his recent divorce and things like that. And so I think he would probably, in a head-to-head matchup in a runoff, be formidable. The question is, can he get there? Both campaigns, and I should say the super PACs supporting Paxton and Cornyn, have both spent a lot of money against Hunt. I think what that tells me is they would rather run against each other. And I think that's sort of been the case all along. I think both feel better about beating the other, if possible. And most every poll has shown Hunt in third place. Most every public poll and, non-internal from the Hunt camp.
Yeah, and so you mentioned sort of running ads, and maybe the Cornyn side and Paxton side would all things considered, prefer to run against each other, probably because it was sort of their plan from the outset.
Right.
Since, Hunt didn't get into the race until October as sort of a third option forever. It just seemed like a Cornyn and Paxton largely head-to-head matchup. And I've now brought up on screen, I wanted to talk about this for a second, because according to Ad Impact, which tracks ad spending and contests, this is now the most expensive most expensive Senate primary anywhere that they have on record, with now just a bit over 110 million either spent or in bookings in the next few days. And I think it's interesting because overall of that, 64 million has gone to supporting John Cornyn.
Yeah.
And yet he finds himself in a, basically running even with Ken Paxton in the polls here, and still well short of 50%. And I guess it's, is there really any sign of a Cornyn late surge here, recovering, or he's clearly a very beleaguered incumbent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I'm really interested to see is what exact number do each of these candidates come in at next week? Because I think there's a big difference between, right, a Paxton Cornyn runoff where Paxton is over 40, for example, and let's say Cornyn is in the low 30s. I think that definitely will set off alarm bells for donors. If it's really close, like a lot of the polls have been showing, I think maybe that's proof positive for what these DC establishment groups that have been supporting Cornyn and donors have been saying, that, look, if you can get, for example, a Trump endorsement, or if we can keep pumping money into this, we can get him over the line. It's going to be difficult, especially because runoffs in Texas do tend to favor the more, conservative, grassrootsy candidate because turnout is lower. But yeah, I mean, when you look at all the money that's already been spent on Cornyn, the idea behind this is if we can get Cornyn through the primary, we being sort of Republicans sitting here in DC as well as his allies in Texas, then they don't need to worry about Texas, right? They can spend money where they want to spend money, in North Carolina, in Maine, in Michigan, all over the map. Now, I think the Paxton camp would point out, okay, but you've already spent tens of millions of dollars. This is really sort of the money saving move that you planned. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the runoff. But yeah, all that money spent on the Cornyn campaign so far, like you mentioned, has brought him and Paxton about even. It has made a difference, though, because, when Paxton first entered the race last spring, he was winning by like a double-digit margin. So it's definitely closed the gap. It just hasn't, launched Cornyn past 50% or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you make. Back when it was a head-to-head race before Hunt got in, the Decision Desk HQ polling average definitely showed Paxton leading. I think the challenge for Cornyn is that kind of what it showed is Paxton lost support, but Cornyn wasn't necessarily picking up a lot. Mm-hmm. Sort of like voters moving into maybe the undecided camp saying, well, maybe I don't want Paxton, but I'm still not necessarily favoring Cornyn here, which then maybe, that may have played into why Wesley Hunt thought, well, you know what, I am going to go ahead and go for it. He was, spent some money trying to broaden his name ID around the state before he got into the race. But I think perhaps that may have actually opened the door a little bit. That'd be kind of a funny thing, right? The Cornyn spending, lowering support for Paxton, but not necessarily boosting it for Cornyn, could have maybe encouraged Hunt to get into the contest. And, I mentioned it sort of there at the outset, but from those ad impact numbers, you do see that the anti-Hunt spending, there has been a little bit here toward the end. And to me, it's the thing that I've been telling people who've been like looking at the polls and whatnot is I don't want to write off Hunt because primaries are weird and there's more polling error. And even if, and I'll bring it up right now, we haven't actually had a chance, I think, to add in the latest poll to the Decision Desk average that just came out in Texas. But it wouldn't really change the broad strokes here, which is that Paxton and Cornyn are locked in the low to mid 30s and Hunt is hovering somewhere around 20, maybe a little bit above 20, maybe a little below percent. And just thinking about polling error and knowing how primaries work, you could have some voters who are thinking about voting for Hunt who get to the polls on election day and have seen some Cornyn ads that are like, you know what, I'm just going to vote for Cornyn. He's probably the safer bet here. Or you'll have some Cornyn voters saying, wow, or some voters who've been thinking about voting for Cornyn saying like, man, Hunt's actually maybe rising here at the end, and he'd probably be a better bet to beat Paxton. And then, it's just the sort of way voters are thinking about this stuff is not necessarily straightforward. I don't know if you've run into any of that in your coverage of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was sort of striking to me throughout polling, and I think it's tightened up as early voting has begun, but the number of voters who were undecided was always like at least 20% in nearly every poll. And I think it's interesting, so far through early voting, we've seen Democrats outvoting Republicans. The Republican electorate that's been turning out has been old. That's been definitely the biggest feature. I don't know if that plays into the race at all. Hunt has sort of made an age-related push, saying that he can sort of carry on the Trump agenda long after Trump is out of office, and certainly Cornyn and Paxton, who are both older than him. So I wonder if that matters as well to voters based on who's turning out. But yeah, I mean, it was always an uphill battle for Hunt, just given that those Paxton and Cornyn are both statewide names who have run and won statewide multiple times, over decades. But yeah, I mean, polling in Texas for primaries is notoriously difficult. So I definitely wouldn't write him off.
In terms of just because if this does go to a primary runoff, a big part of the conversation is going to be about if it's Paxton versus Cornyn, which does seem like the most likely matchup. Clearly, there's going to be, and you mentioned it already a little bit, but the conversations about is Paxton a weaker general election candidate? Some of the general election polling, it's early, so I don't want to take it all to the bank, but it does seem to suggest that at least a little, at least a small extent, that Paxton is in a closer race with either of the Democratic potential nominees. And so I guess for Republicans who are looking to keep this off the board, is there something else they can throw it, sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall? And I say this because you actually had, I saw just the ad today from the John Cornyn NRSC sort of joint fundraising committee. They put out an ad where they basically are just going after Paxton so hard. And is it possible, though, that the National Republican Senatorial Committee is going to find itself having to defend Paxton as the Republican nominee? I mean,
absolutely.
It's a strange situation. Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of unprecedented, how much they've been attacking a fellow Republican, sort of breaking the Buckley rule there, who could very well be the nominee, right? Has been leading most polls, tied or leading most polls to be the nominee. I think everybody acknowledges that Texas will certainly be closer than it was in 2024, just given that this looks like a better cycle for Democrats than last year was. And, depending on who the Democratic candidate is and what exactly the matchup is, I think Republicans might have to spend some level of money there on the Senate race, perhaps regardless. I think certainly people in the Cornyn camp would say Cornyn, can take care of it himself. He's a good fundraiser. All that. He doesn't necessarily need all this air cover like he's getting now in the primary. But yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of general election competitiveness, it's not the top of the board for the Democrats, right? It's not Maine, it's not North Carolina. I'd say it's not even, right, maybe Ohio and Alaska in terms of how they're thinking about these races. But I would definitely say that, and again, depending on what exactly the general election matchup is, there's certainly going to be a lot of intrigue in this race, and not just on Senate, but I think, people forget Beto O'Rourke in 2018 when he lost by about 2.5 to Ted Cruz. What did happen was that down ballot, Democrats flipped 2 congressional seats, 2 state Senate seats. I think they flipped 12 seats in the state house. So that's the kind of stuff where it might really matter exactly who's on this Senate race and exactly what the margin is at the top, even if, as has happened, every time for the last however many cycles, the Republican wins.
No, that's an excellent point about the potential sort of down ballot impact. And thinking back to the 2018 example, Beto O'Rourke raised gobs and gobs and gobs of money, but obviously came up just a little bit short against Ted Cruz. And so actually maybe this is a good time, though, thinking about Beto O'Rourke, who was looking at this race potentially or running for governor again, or was part of some of those conversations among sort of leading Democrats behind the scenes, but ended up not running. Maybe it's a good time to switch over to the Democratic race, where we have Representative Jasmine Crockett and State Representative James Talarico. And, there was some new polling that had Crockett up by 56 to 44. And that was notable, given that we hadn't actually had any public polling of this race that had been conducted since late January. And so it's interesting because on the one hand, we have some polling evidence here, and I think there's also been some cases made that early voting has shown that areas where Crockett would be expected to do well have turned out pretty well so far. But at the same time, it does seem like, not to just bring prediction markets into it, but it just seems like there's a lot of good vibes around James Talarico. And so sorting out, sort of trying to, truth from fiction here about Crockett's probably favored, all things considered.
Yeah. New poll came out this morning from UT that showed her up 12, right? And it was a small sample and a pretty high margin of error, but, the margin was well beyond. I would say, just given that her name ID throughout has been higher than his, right? And I think that can't be discounted, even if, the sort of online buzz and the prediction markets, like you mentioned, sort of seem to be around Talarico. Crockett is someone that Democratic voters know, and she, absolutely has that sort of fighter personality and mentality that voters have said they're looking for. Talarico, a much more, I think, barnstorming the state, has been for months, tons of events. He's sort of everywhere. They're both really active on social media and online. So I think I saw this described as sort of a political science question of like a traditional well-run campaign apparatus with Talarico versus, name ID, and Crockett, who's really good at earned media, as we call it, right? So, not necessarily not having to buy an ad to like get in front of people's faces. She's really good at generating attention and generating media. So it's going to be really interesting. Like I said, Texas primary is notoriously difficult to poll. I have a feeling this one is going to be close. And I would say the main thing that people should look at is how Latino voters break. I think it's, undoubted that Crockett's going to win black voters by huge margins. That's what we've seen across polls. Most polls show Talarico winning white voters, sort of some by smaller margins, some by larger margins. I think the Latino vote, as it often is, will probably be determinative in this primary. I think right now the latest we saw in early voting is that they're coming in at, I want to say, over a third of the Democratic electorate. So this is a huge chunk of voters. The primary electorate, I think, is much younger and much more Latino than we're typically seeing so far through early voting. There's still several more days of early voting and, of course, election day, so that could change. And polls have shown a bit of a mixed bag. Some have shown Talarico winning the Latino vote by 10-ish. Some have shown the one that came out today, I think Crockett was up by 6. So I think that's really anyone's guess. And, it could be different. Both have made campaign stops in the RGV, talking to Tejano voters in the Rio Grande Valley. But, there's tons of Latino voters more in Houston, in Dallas, of course, in San Antonio, Austin. So the regional differences there will be interesting to me as well when all is said and done on Tuesday.
Right. I know that Talarico has at times, and let me just say, actually, I brought up our primary average. We still haven't added that new University of Texas poll on this one either. So Crockett would probably be ahead by a little bit more than the 5 points or so she's leading in our average. So maybe call it 8, 10 once we factor that new poll in. So kind of close to what that latest result said from Texas. And again, we hadn't had any public data in a long time, no campaign internals, which I also think is interesting that neither side was releasing data either to spur, donations, which is so often the focus and the reason you release polls that are done on behalf of your campaign. But we'd seen nothing over the past almost nearly a month. But I was going to say that Talarico, speaking of Latino voters and thinking about their importance in the primary, it does seem like Talarico has made a concerted effort to connect himself to some down ballot candidates who are Latino candidates. Was it Bobby Polito? I think I'm thinking of.
Yeah, they had a cross endorsement. Yep, they had an event together and did a podcast, I think. And then Crockett actually endorsed his primary opponent, Ada Cuellar, who's also Latina, further left than Bobby Polito. So it's played out. This Crockett Talarico, which has turned a little ugly in the last few weeks, has been playing out, across with these down ballot candidates too.
Yeah, and in terms of it turning ugly, obviously, I know one major news item was the claim that Talarico basically said Colin Allred, who had previously been in this race, former congressman, and is actually running basically for his old seat in the House, or more or less what is his old seat under the new map, that Talarico had said behind the scenes had said like a mediocre black man or something, or that was
the allegation.
The allegation is that
right.
Talarico,
and then Talarico said, "I didn't call Allred a mediocre black man. I said his 2024 Senate campaign was mediocre." So that's just been a sort of on a very online sort of a primary.
Then all read very quickly. Then openly endorsed Crockett after saying that he hadn't planned on endorsing, but then basically that was enough to get him off the fence on that, or at least engage in terms of endorsing. And I guess if there, is there also, I think there does seem to be a line of conversation among national Democrats who are worried that Crockett is not as good of a general election candidate as Talarico would be. Whether or not that's actually true, I think the polling marginally shows that, but again, not massive differences. And, it may matter who the Republican opponent is too. So I was kind of curious what is actually the view in Texas politics about this, because it's really getting into a lot of issues of race and gender, and obviously the Democratic primary electorate is very diverse, and it can be contentious.
Yeah, I mean, I think Republicans, no doubt, would rather face Crockett. I mean, I think they've made no secret of that. The NRSC, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, sort of boosted Crockett with a bit of an AstroTurf campaign before she announced. Governor Abbott has already sort of used her in some early advertising he's done as one of several Democratic villains that he thinks can help juice Republicans to turn out. And they have different theories of the electorate. So Talarico, I think, has not been shy about saying we need independent voters and moderate Republicans, and he feels like he can speak to them, especially sort of connecting over faith. He's really led with being a Christian and sort of a progressive Christian. Crockett has sort of dismissed that and said, Texas has really low voter turnout relative to the rest of the country, that there are these sort of legions of disaffected non-voters or infrequent voters that she feels like through her sort of non-conventional style that she can turn out. And so it's a bit of a persuasion versus turnout debate, not dissimilar actually to sort of the Paxton-Cornyn debate about what kind of electorate they want, ironically. But yeah, I think the Talarico model of speaking to independents and moderate Republicans, I think, that's what worked for Taylor Remitt, for example, the state Senate candidate in Tarrant County who just flipped a seat. He got, I think, the vast majority of the independent support in that race. Off cycle and special election and all that, but those are the sort of arguments that are playing out, and you see Democrats come down on both sides. But no doubt, Republicans, I think, would rather face Crockett.
And sort of just thinking about the final, I'm going to turn back to this ad spending data. It does seem like, to your point about sort of Talarico running maybe a more conventional campaign than Crockett, you do see Talarico between his campaign, which I know has raised more than Crockett's, and then also outside spending help. Overall, Ad Impact had the data as of February 23rd at Talarico having close to $18 million in ad support, and Crockett having a little more than $4 million. So, you're talking more than a 4-to-1 advantage for Talarico. And that seems striking. And given that Talarico has a lower name ID, as you mentioned, than Crockett, is this maybe the reason why we're still seeing kind of regardless of the polls, seeing some of the Talarico can win this kind of conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you live in Texas, you're seeing more Talarico ads than Crockett ads, mailers, what have you. I mean, this has just been a better funded campaign thus far. And he also had, he's been campaigning since September, I believe, is when he launched. Crockett, right, sort of got in at the last minute in December. And so, that's part of it too. He had months of runway to build up his campaign, and people were seeing him and knew he was running for Senate, all that. So yeah, I think that definitely has been the advantage that Talarico brings, is that sort of much better funding, so much better spending so far, higher spending, and has outraised Crockett, even though she's been one of the most prolific fundraisers in the U.S. House as a Democratic congresswoman.
Yeah, that was the part about it that was particularly interesting to me, was that Crockett has been such a strong fundraiser when it came to her house, her house account, but that Talarico was doing so well. Relative to her, I mean, it's not like she wasn't raising anything. It's just Talarico was raising a lot.
Yeah.
And so, maybe this is. What are people saying anything about sort of a James Talarico Beto O'Rourke comparison here? Because I know that there's got to be at least some line.
Yeah, I think you hear it. I mean, I think you hear it for sure. I mean, O'Rourke, I think, he barnstormed the state, right? He went to every county. Talarico's not doing that, but he's certainly, I think, going to
They're what,
both of them
200
have been going to
and how many? 200 and
254.
over. Yeah, there you go. I was like, I know they're more than 200, and I couldn't remember if it was 240 or 250. Yeah.
Quite a few, yes. I mean, Talarico, I think just this week he was at Texas A&M. He's going to University of Tyler, or he already did. I can't remember, for a rally. Crockett too. I think they were both in Lubbock recently. So they're not just doing Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, right? RGB. I think they're both making a point to crisscross. But Talarico, right? I mean, Crockett goes to DC every week. Talarico doesn't have to do that. So yeah, I mean, he's had tons of events all over, big rallies, tons of attendance, standing room only. So I think definitely. People are always looking for shades of Beto O'Rourke, right? Democrats in Texas. And I think, yeah, that comparison has been made.
Cool. Obviously, close race. There is a very slim chance that this could go to a runoff. There is a third minor candidate on the ballot, but odds are these two candidates will be winning almost all of the vote. And so someone will probably clear 50%.
Most likely.
But that would be just sort of the amusing. We've seen this happen before. Very tight race in a state that has runoffs. I remember Thad Cochran and Republican primary in 2014 famously managed to survive, in part because he narrowly was trailing in the first round against a more conservative Republican opponent. But the third candidate in the race got a couple percent, and they both were just under 50, and it forced into a runoff. And obviously, with a May 26th runoff date, that would be a lot more time for advertising. A lot more developments could happen in the race. But obviously, it seems more likely to happen on the Republican side. To transition over to the sort of the U.S. House picture, we're not going to cover every U.S. House race because there are a lot of interesting primaries in the U.S. House. But I did think that one interesting thing that could be going on here in Texas, and we mentioned this actually in our previous conversation back in December, but we could see potentially like near-term record turnover in the House delegation from Texas. So right now, at least one of Al Green or Christian Menifee is not going to win their primary. So assuming one of them, including one of them, we don't know who it will be yet, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You're going to have at least 10 incumbents who are currently serving are not going to be there anymore. And that number could rise to as many as, I think, 13. I mean, who knows? There might be another surprise waiting. But the point is that would
then it depends if some general election losses could happen too. So, yeah.
Correct. Yes. And so I'm just thinking about the primaries. Yes.
Right.
So at this point, about 10 of 38 incumbents will not be back at the very least. And so that's about 26% of the delegation, which puts it kind of close to some high points that we saw 2018, 2004 famously after another redistricting cycle. Republicans redistricted the state ahead of the 2004 elections. And then also 1996, like 30%. And so I only went back to the early 90s on this stat, but it's very possible that if you get like two more, basically, you jump up to up higher than any of those, and like 32% or so. So I was curious, just thinking about that. This is a potentially one of those cycles to remember in Texas in terms of maybe a changing of the guard in politics there.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really different delegation that we see come 2027, particularly on the Republican side, right? You have 6 retirements. You have the potential for up to 5 new people coming in with these redistricted seats if they were to win all 5. But even if they only win 3, let's say, that's 3 new people. And a lot of the people leaving are those more senior members. And Texas Republicans, because they send more Republicans to the U.S. House than any other state, if they band together and they want something historically, right, they can speak with a really loud voice in the Republican conference. But as the delegation has gotten less senior and also just more ideologically divided, where some of these members might see themselves as a Freedom Caucus person first and a Texas delegation member second, right? And you've got people spanning from problem solvers to Freedom Caucus and everything in between. That sort of Texas power, I think, has definitely diminished and will only, more so diminish as some of these Michael McCall, Jody Arrington, right? Former committee chairs or current committee chairs leave. And it'll be really interesting with these primaries to see not all of them have like a establishment versus grassroots MAGA, whatever you want to call it. Not all of them have that dynamic, but some do, and it'll be interesting to see sort of what wings of the party or what these new members represent or what interests they bring to the table, because it is going to be a really new looking delegation.
Well, obviously, a fascinating time for watching U.S. House races. Texas, as I mentioned, one of the states that redistricted, sort of kickstarted perhaps this national redistricting war in the 2026 cycle by drawing a map that has the intention of picking up 5 more House seats for Republicans. Remains to be seen if they'll actually get that. It seems like they'll get at least 2, and then from there it's maybe 3's the most likely, or 4. But will they actually get all 5? They've targeted a couple Democrats in South Texas, in Henry Cuellar and Vicente Gonzalez, who could maybe hold on in Trump won seats, and especially if Latino voters swing back to any substantial degree toward Democrats in the 2026 midterms. But thinking about another border representative, I think maybe it's a good time to shift over to some of the specific House races we wanted to bring up. And we're going to start with the one that's really been making all the headlines. And that is the Tony Gonzalez race against Brandon Herrera in the 23rd Congressional District, which stretches from outside of El Paso over to around San Antonio. And Gonzalez is obviously, it's been in the news, been lurking in the news for a while that this former staffer of his had committed suicide, that there was allegations that he'd had an affair with her. But really in the last couple of weeks, it seems like a ton of stuff has come out, and I have to think it's pretty damaging to Gonzalez's reelection hopes.
Yeah. So credit to the San Antonio Express News, who sort of broke the story. They were the first outlet to get sort of evidentiary, to get evidence that they had screenshot of a text message initially in which the staffer who ended up killing herself was texting a coworker mentioning she had an affair with their boss. And then the lawyer for the widow of that staffer released text messages from the ex-staffer's phone between Gonzalez and the aide, which were really damning, very explicit. So yeah, I mean, this story has really taken off in the last week or so. You've had some of the more conservative right-wing members of the U.S. House, some of whom were already supporting his primary opponent, Brandon Herrera, say that Gonzalez should resign. You've had a few members of the Texas delegation say that Gonzalez should drop out of the race. Primaries next week, so we'll see. Last cycle, these two ran against each other. Herrera was a first-time candidate, went to a runoff, and as you can see here, Herrera only lost by less than 400 votes. So I think even without this was going to be a close race. And now with this looming over Gonzalez, I think it's certainly going to be difficult. And I think it's a district that's pretty well drawn for Republicans. It would take a lot for a Republican to lose, but it's an awkward situation, certainly for Republican leadership who's backed Gonzalez, particularly because Herrera is very far right, is associated with some of these Freedom Caucus types, and I think would definitely be, to talk about the politics of it, would be a much more difficult member to manage for leadership.
Yeah, I've brought up on screen the 2024 primary and primary runoff results between Gonzalez and Herrera. Gonzalez finished finished below 50% in the primary, which wasn't a good sign. And then he very narrowly won in the runoff. And it took a lot of help. He had a lot of outside help from more establishment Republican types in that runoff, a lot of spending on his behalf. Now, this time around, I think a couple months ago, even when we chatted in December, how in danger Gonzalez was, I think that there was an expectation that it would be competitive again because Herrera had done well, and Gonzalez, especially, things like he had supported some gun safety legislation because Uvalde is in that district after the shooting in Uvalde, the school shooting in Uvalde, has maybe opened up the door for Herrera, who's literally like a gun influencer online. But Gonzalez had Trump's endorsement, which he didn't have the last time. And so I was this seems, to your point about sort of Republican leadership having backed Gonzalez maybe more clearly this time, this has put them in maybe a tough spot.
And I think you've definitely seen a wait and see approach from the speaker. I think a lot of people probably are more hesitant because the primary is literally a week from, yesterday, and early voting had been ongoing. But I'll be curious to see exactly what the result comes in on Tuesday. And then, we know that the matter has been referred to the ethics committee in the House. I would assume a report will come out at some point, and just sort of how this snowballs from there.
Yeah, my understanding is that the House Ethics Committee rules basically don't allow it to release reports, I think within 60 days of an election dealing with the members. So I guess I wonder if they go into a runoff, does that still qualify?
There's
I'm
time.
not sure.
There would be like time at the beginning.
Yeah. So, you know, all things considered, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, sorry, it's almost 3 months away. So yes, there would be time. And then if you did have a runoff, which is possible, again, there are multiple candidates besides those two running again. Probably won't get a lot of the vote. Although one is Kiko Canseco, who is a former congressman in his own right, who's running, though I don't think he's really run much of a campaign.
I think a Herrera internal had Canseco at maybe 4%. So
yeah, and it's worth noting that most recent Herrera internal did have him up 45-21 over Gonzalez, which is that's a pretty rough spot for an incumbent to be in. But, you know, it is possible to have a runoff. Anyway, Gonzalez might be the most endangered incumbent on the ballot. But I think, to move on to some other possibilities, there's also Al Green in the new 18th congressional district, is facing newly elected Representative Christian Menifee. Menifee was elected to the old 18th in a special election that just took place, or just finished off basically at the end of January. And Menifee now is turning around and running for the regular term in the new 18th against Green. And now Green made some news at the State of the Union, as he did actually at the previous State of the Union, or the previous presidential address in 2025 as well. But he was holding up a sign, I think, that said, you know, Black people are not apes, in reference to a video on social media that President Trump retweeted that had images of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama as gorillas. And that got Green removed from the chamber. And I couldn't help, but obviously there's like a lot more going on with that situation than just the electoral politics of it. But seeing as Menifee has released a number of polls showing him ahead of Green, I wondered about this being, you know, a reminder to voters back home that Green has been a very vocal progressive member of the House.
For sure, yeah, and I think Green's a recognizable guy. He carries around his cane. If you've seen a picture of him, you probably know who we're talking about. He's been in the House for 20 years, but this is basically his first competitive campaign since he actually unseated an incumbent in the 2004 election, and he really has not had any difficulty since then. And so I think, you know, and Menifee, by contrast, right, has been running for almost a year for the old 18 and now the new 18. He's got a very active campaign apparatus. That's a muscle that's warm for him. And for Green, that's not a muscle he's had to flex in a while. So I was actually down in Houston before the special election in January talking to folks about this. And I think the other dynamic to remember here is that all around the country, right, we're seeing Democratic primaries where age and sort of generational change are factoring into people's decisions. Menifee's in his 30s, Green's in his 70s, but they're both incumbents, right? But the extra dynamic here is that the last two occupants of this seat, Congressional District 18, both died in office. Sylvester Turner, the former mayor of Houston, died just 2 months into his term about a year ago. And then Sheila Jackson Lee, who was the longtime representative for that seat, died in office in 2024. So this is a seat, and only about 25% of the new version of the seat is the old one. But if you're in Houston, you know about this situation if you follow politics, most likely. And I think this is something that's on voters' minds from what I could tell when I was down there talking to folks.
Yeah, because that's the thing with the new district map. The old 9th district, which is Al Green's current seat, has been redrawn very dramatically into one of those new Republican-leaning seats that the GOP intends, and that's one of the ones that they're almost certainly going to capture in November. But nearly 2/3 of Green's old 9th district ended up in the new 18th, and whereas only, as you mentioned, only about a quarter of the current 18th is in the new 18th. And so in that sense, the voters who will be voting in this primary are more familiar with Green. But as you did say, like, in terms of running ads, Menifee's been, active politically campaigning for such a long time. And at the end of the day, a lot of that's going to hit you in Harris County, regardless of where you are, right?
Yeah.
So I would assume that that's like another part of the dynamic here.
Yeah, for sure. And then the last thing there is that a pro-crypto group is now spending against Green for Menifee as well, and that's sort of the first race they've weighed in on in Texas this cycle, and so that's some air cover too.
See, that's and that you get a little extra outside spending coming in, and you might already be ahead, and that might be enough for Menifee to win. Now, again, one of these two is going to lose, so that's part of that group of 10 that I already mentioned will be on the outs. Possibly Gonzalez might join them. That might be 11. Well, another safe Democratic district we'll turn to, but in the Dallas area, we have Representative Julie Johnson, and she is facing former Representative Colin Allred, who represented much of the same turf, but when he ran for the Senate in 2024, Johnson won the open seat to succeed him. But now Allred dropped out of the Senate race and decided to run for what is more or less his old seat, but run against Johnson for this new version of their old seat, if you will, in the 33rd district. And I know there really hasn't been much polling of this race. I mean, a lot of times in House races and House primaries, there's not necessarily a ton of polling. But the Allred campaign did have an internal back from mid-December that showed him well ahead. And so I was curious sort of what the dynamics are looking like in this seat, which I'm going to actually bring this up on the map here. It's the new 33rd, which is worth noting. There was so many. Mark Vasey, I think, was talked about as potentially running in this seat, but then he decided to run for a different office, but then dropped out of that race and is now just retiring. So part of the redistricting mess, if you will.
Yes, and it really was a mess in DFW in the Metroplex. This race is definitely interesting. Allred put out that internal, but in December, right, that showed him up big. Certainly would imagine his name ID is much higher, just given that he ran statewide. This district is about a third of what was both Johnson and Allred's old district. So a lot of them, it's new voters, but again, Allred's been on their ballot before because he was their Democratic Senate candidate. On the other hand, Allred went up with a negative ad against Johnson, so we'll see how that plays. But I think the fact that he went negative shows it might be closer than that initial poll might have suggested. This is a majority minority district. Allred is black, Johnson is white, and so Johnson.
But the largest group is sorry to interrupt. The largest group is Latinos.
Right. So it's a really interesting one. And Johnson has a lot of support from the sort of Democratic leadership. She got an endorsement from AOC, a bunch of groups up here in DC. So this is an interesting one. And I really am not entirely sure how that one will play out, but we'll know soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And drawn to be a safely Democratic seat as part of basically they turned the Republican map makers turned Johnson's old 32nd, which only part of that, as you said, is in this new 33rd, into a much redder seat that Republicans will very likely capture in November. Those are sort of the 32nd, the new 9th and the new 32nd are sort of the two more or less sure things for Republicans on the map that they drew in terms of the 5 that they want to take. Mm-hmm. The other 3 are all seats that Trump won by around 10 percentage points, and depending on the environment, could maybe don't work out as well as Republicans had hoped, at least in this cycle. Yeah. But thinking about one other wrinkle, I guess, is that Johnson is a member of the LGBTQ community, and I know that was at least initially when Allred dropped down, there were definitely some attacks from groups that support candidates who are LGBTQ. And so I was kind of curious if there had been any more on that front in terms of as a thing that people are using against Allred.
Yeah, I mean, those groups are all supporting Johnson for sure. There was also, I think, some sort of gender back and forth at the beginning, and I think Johnson made a comment about women aren't just something to the effect of women aren't seat warmers, basically, type thing. So yeah, I mean, this has definitely gotten a bit personal. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
And actually, as a point of comparison, even though we've moved on to this race, I was curious if there was any of that sort of feeling in the 18th district race between Green and Menifee, sort of the personal element of it, because it does feel like the Johnson-Allred contest has gotten nasty, and obviously Herrera and Gonzalez were nasty in 2024, and was already pretty ugly just before even all this other stuff was sort of came to light.
Yeah, that one not so much. No, I don't think it's been as personal between Green and Menifee. They've sort of just focused on their own lanes, and both sort of blamed Republicans for redrawing and being in this position. No, I don't. It's not been as sort of mudslinging back and forth.
Got it. Well, we're going to go over one more here. There are other races of note. I plan on having a Texas primary preview in our next newsletter on Monday, where I will try to go into at least to some extent all the races of interest. But the last one I wanted to mention here is another incumbent, and this one is down back in the Houston area, mm-hmm. and this is Dan Crenshaw, mm-hmm. Who people may know, military veteran, has been in the House for a few years now, wears an eye patch, kind of well-known figure. But he has a challenger from the right in State Representative Steve Toth. Mm-hmm. Toth? I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yep. And Toth just got an endorsement from Senator Ted Cruz. Yeah. And I think there is some thought that he could end up defeating Crenshaw at the end of the day.
This is definitely a competitive race. I believe there's only two other candidates in the race, both receiving small amounts of support. So certainly a chance that this could be ended in the primary one way or the other. But yeah, Toth, one of the most right-wing conservative members of the state house, has sort of, he's gone and talked about this race with Tucker Carlson and some local sort of Houston conservative radio czars who've been supporting him. On the other hand, Crenshaw has tried to attack Toth over some votes he's taken in the Texas House on some hot button issues, both in the area, especially flooding. This is an area that's had a lot of issues with flooding, especially with Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which people remember. As well as property taxes, which is just like a hot issue around the state, but especially among Republicans right now. So it's going to be an interesting one. Toth, if people remember, 10 years ago, launched a primary against Kevin Brady, the longtime representative from Texas's 8th District, former Ways and Means chair. And Brady did win outright in the primary, but it was with his lowest percentage since his first race, I believe, at 53%. So Toth has a history of running competitive, but he wasn't able to do it in 2016. So we'll see how it plays out this time. I think the Cruz endorsement yesterday, definitely a big news point here.
Yeah, so it does feel like, I know Crenshaw has also come under some scrutiny for potentially some alcohol-related behavior on some international trips, and it's just I think has become a figure, besides maybe some personal conduct things that have come up, is also, it seems like maybe the MAGA universe has cooled on him a bit.
I think definitely the people who are really into more isolationist foreign policy feel like, he's someone who was in the military, I think, supports funding for Ukraine, for example. And so I think some of the most ardent isolationist, people in that wing of the party, I think, certainly he's been a figure that they've been upset with for a while.
Yeah, and this is a safely Republican seat, so the winner of the GOP nomination will win in November. This isn't one that's going to come on the board as a competitive general election contest, even if Toth ends up maybe being a weaker general election candidate. If he wins, TBD, obviously. Yeah. Hey, there's a ton more, and we're not going to touch on any more of it in this episode, but I will say that people should go check out your writing and that of your colleagues over at the Texas Tribune. I don't know if you want to say anything about the Texas Tribune for a minute.
Yeah, Texas Tribune. We are statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit. Definitely check us out. We've got a lot of great politics coverage. We'll have it, through the primary, through the runoff, and through the general.
Yeah, that's I think texastribune.org, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, and definitely check that out. They have tons of good articles. I spent a fair amount of time prepping, reading over things there before this podcast, and we'll certainly be linking to them a fair amount in my Texas primary preview. Anyway, this has been great. Gabby Birenbaum, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast to talk about Texas. It is always an interesting state, but obviously with the redistricting and having a potentially competitive general election for the Senate and two highly competitive primaries for the Senate, it's maybe even more interesting than usual.
Absolutely. It's going to be fun. And thank you so much for having me.
Yes, well, it's been great. And so I'm Geoffrey Skelley, again, the host here at the Decision Desk HQ Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and make sure to check out my Texas primary preview on Monday. And thank you again, Gabby.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Hey, take care.